Something is breaking in America, and you can see it in the numbers. Right now, nearly 60% of Americans say they're living paycheck to paycheck, even many people earning over $100,000 a year. Household debt just crossed $17.5 trillion, the highest level ever recorded. Credit card balances alone passed $1.1 trillion, while the average rent in the U.S. has surged more than 30% since 2019. And here's the part that should really make you stop for a second. According to multiple national surveys, over 70% of Americans say they feel financially stressed most of the time, and more than half believe the system is no longer working for ordinary people. That's not normal. That's a warning sign. Because when millions of people start feeling squeezed from every direction at once, rising prices, rising debt, rising stress, it creates the kind of pressure that societies historically don't handle well. And if you've felt like something in the country has shifted over the last few years, you're not imagining it. Something is happening in America, and more people than ever are quietly reaching their breaking point. Americans are working more than ever, yet somehow falling further behind. Here's something that should honestly make you stop and think for a second. Because when you really look at the numbers, the situation unfolding in America right now is almost unbelievable. The average American worker today is actually more productive than at any other point in modern history. Yet millions of people feel like they're barely surviving financially. According to data from the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics and the Economic Policy Institute, worker productivity has increased by roughly 64% since 1980, meaning Americans are producing dramatically more economic value every single hour they work. But here's the part that nobody really talks about enough. Median wages have only increased around 17% during that same period when adjusted for inflation. That gap, the massive distance between productivity and wages, means the wealth created by workers is increasingly flowing somewhere else. And when you dig deeper into the data, it becomes even more shocking. The top 1% of Americans now control over 32% of total wealth in the United States, while the bottom half of the population collectively owns less than 3%. That imbalance didn't happen overnight, but over the last decade it has accelerated dramatically. At the same time, the cost of essential life milestones has exploded. The average price of a home in the U.S. has jumped more than 47% since 2020. Childcare in many states now costs more than in-state college tuition, and healthcare spending per person has climbed past $13,000 per year on average, the highest in the world by a wide margin. So you end up with this bizarre situation where people are working full-time jobs, sometimes 2 jobs, doing everything they were told to do growing up: go to school, get a degree, build a career, and yet they still feel like the finish line keeps moving further away every single year. And psychologically, that does something to a society, because when people begin to realize that effort no longer guarantees stability, motivation starts to collapse. That's why surveys now show over 60% of Americans say they feel financially insecure despite being employed, and a growing number admit they've stopped believing in the traditional version of the American dream altogether. It's not just frustration, it's the creeping feeling that the rules of the system quietly changed while everyone was busy trying to keep up. And when millions of people start reaching that conclusion at the same time, that's usually the moment when societies begin approaching a breaking point. Over the last few years, you've probably heard people say something that sounds almost identical. It feels like time is moving differently now. And what's fascinating is that this isn't just some vague emotional reaction people are having. Online researchers are actually studying this phenomenon because so many individuals are reporting the exact same experience. Since 2020, psychologists and neuroscientists have been investigating what they call temporal distortion under chronic stress, and the findings are honestly pretty disturbing. When humans experience long periods of uncertainty, disruption, and digital overstimulation, the brain's perception of time begins to change. Days blur together, weeks disappear, entire years feel strangely compressed. Studies from universities like Stanford and the University of California found that over 70% of adults reported losing track of time more frequently after the pandemic, and a large portion of respondents said the last few years felt like they passed both extremely fast and strangely empty at the same time. The reason has to do with how memory works. Our brains measure time based on how many distinct experiences we store. When life becomes repetitive, wake up, check phone, work, scroll social media, repeat, the brain records fewer unique memories, which makes months feel shorter in retrospect. But the real shock comes when you look at how digital life has amplified this effect. The average American now spends over 4.5 hours per day on their phone alone, not counting computers or televisions. In total, Americans are consuming around 11 hours of media per day, meaning more than half of waking life is now spent interacting with screens. And the brain simply wasn't designed for that level of stimulation. Every notification, every headline, every viral video triggers a tiny spike of dopamine or cortisol, keeping the nervous system in a constant state of low-level alert. Over time, that leads to exhaustion, emotional numbness, and the strange sense that reality itself feels distant or artificial. Neuroscientists refer to this as continuous partial attention, where the brain is always reacting to incoming information but never fully present in the physical world. And here's the part that should really get your attention. Researchers are now warning that this constant digital immersion may be altering attention spans, memory formation, and even emotional resilience on a societal scale. In other words, when millions of people simultaneously feel like life no longer feels real, it may not be paranoia or imagination, it may simply be the psychological side effect of living inside the most technologically saturated environment humans have ever experienced. America is quietly experiencing a mental health collapse, and the numbers are alarming. If you want to understand why so many people say something feels off in America right now, you don't even have to look at politics or the economy first. You just have to look at the mental health statistics, because they reveal something deeply unsettling about the state of the country. Over the last decade, and especially since 2020, the United States has experienced one of the most dramatic increases in psychological distress ever recorded in modern public health data. According to the CDC, depression rates among American adults have more than doubled since 2019, with young adults being hit the hardest. Among people aged 18 to 25, nearly half report experiencing symptoms of anxiety or depression, a number that would have been considered unimaginable 20 years ago. But the truly shocking statistic is this: the United States now records over 49,000 suicides per year, the highest number ever documented in the country's history. And experts believe that number may still be underreported. Think about what that means for a moment. More Americans are dying from suicide each year than from car accidents or many major diseases, yet the topic barely enters the national conversation in a meaningful way. Psychologists say one of the biggest drivers behind this surge is what they call chronic societal instability. Humans are incredibly resilient in the face of short-term crises, wars, natural disasters, pandemics, but what damages mental health far more severely is when instability becomes permanent. And that's exactly what millions of Americans feel right now. Constant financial pressure, non-stop digital noise, political conflict everywhere, and an overwhelming sense that the future is uncertain. The brain was never designed to live in a perpetual state of alertness like this. Add in the fact that Americans are sleeping less than ever, averaging about 6.5 hours per night, compared to over 8 hours in the 1960s, and you begin to see a society running on emotional fumes. What's even more disturbing is how normalized this exhaustion has become. Burnout used to be something people talked about occasionally, now it's practically a default state of life. Surveys from Gallup show over 75% of workers report experiencing burnout at least sometimes, and nearly half say they feel burned out often or always. When a majority of a population feels constantly overwhelmed, constantly tired, and constantly unsure about the future, it doesn't just affect individuals, it starts to affect the entire culture. People withdraw, patience disappears, empathy declines, and eventually the emotional foundation that holds a society together begins to weaken in ways that are difficult to repair once they reach a certain point. Young Americans are quietly losing faith in the entire system. Now here's something even more significant, and honestly more shocking because it points to where the country might be heading over the next few decades. A growing number of young Americans are beginning to lose trust not just in specific institutions, but in the entire system itself. And when researchers started measuring this shift, the results were almost unbelievable. According to Pew Research, less than 20% of Americans under the age of 30 say they trust the federal government to do the right thing most of the time, one of the lowest levels ever recorded. But it goes far beyond government. Trust in media has collapsed. Trust in corporations has fallen. Even trust in higher education, the traditional pathway to success in America, has started to erode. For decades, the formula seemed simple. Work hard in school, get a degree, build a career, buy a house, and your life will steadily improve. But the reality confronting younger generations looks very different. Student loan debt in the United States has now reached over $1.7 trillion, affecting roughly 45 million Americans, many of whom are paying hundreds of dollars a month for degrees that no longer guarantee financial stability. At the same time, the cost of entering adulthood has skyrocketed. In 1980, the median home cost roughly 3 times the average annual income. Today, in many cities, it's closer to 7 or even 10 times the average income, making homeownership feel almost unattainable for millions of people. That financial pressure has created a dramatic shift in expectations. Surveys now show over half of Gen Z believes they will never achieve the same financial stability their parents had, which is one of the most profound generational outlook shifts in modern American history. And when an entire generation begins to believe that the system no longer works for them, that belief changes behavior. People delay having children, they move back in with family, they abandon traditional career paths, some opt out entirely and search for alternative lifestyles outside the mainstream economy. Sociologists refer to this as institutional disillusionment, and historically it tends to emerge during periods when societies are undergoing major economic and technological transitions. The reason this matters so much is simple. When young people lose faith in the system meant to sustain them, the long-term stability of that system itself begins to come into question. And that is exactly the kind of shift that experts are quietly warning may already be unfolding across the United States right now. The American dream is quietly disappearing for the first time in modern history. Something else is happening beneath the surface that most people don't fully realize yet. And when you look at the data, it becomes almost impossible to ignore. For the first time in modern American history, the promise that each generation will do better than the one before it is beginning to collapse. For nearly a century, the entire cultural foundation of the United States was built around one simple belief that if you worked hard enough, the next generation would live a better life. But research from economists at Harvard and Stanford tracking income mobility across decades found something extremely disturbing. Americans born in the 1940s had about a 90% chance of earning more than their parents by the time they reached adulthood. Today, for children born in the 1980s and 1990s, that number has dropped to around 50% or even lower, depending on the region. In other words, for the first time in the modern era, it's basically a coin flip whether someone will actually surpass their parents economically. Now think about what that does psychologically to a country that built its entire identity around upward mobility. When people begin to feel like progress is no longer guaranteed, the entire narrative of the American dream begins to crack, and you can see it everywhere. The average age of first-time homebuyers has risen to nearly 36, the highest ever recorded. The number of young adults living with their parents has reached levels not seen since the Great Depression. Birth rates have fallen to the lowest levels in U.S. history, largely because many couples say they simply cannot afford to raise children. Even something as basic as retirement is becoming uncertain. Roughly half of Americans now believe they will never be able to retire comfortably, and a growing percentage expects to work well into their 70s or 80s just to survive. And when people start realizing that the life path they were promised may never materialize, it creates a very specific kind of frustration, not explosive anger at first, but something quieter and more unsettling. It becomes resignation, a feeling that the system no longer rewards effort the way it once did. And once that perception spreads widely enough, societies begin to change in unpredictable ways because millions of people start asking the same question at the same time. If the promise of the system is no longer real, then why keep playing by its rules? America is becoming a country of permanent financial stress. Another development that almost perfectly explains why so many Americans feel like they're reaching a breaking point is something economists refer to as permanent financial pressure. And the numbers behind it are honestly staggering. Right now, nearly 60% of Americans report living paycheck to paycheck, including a surprising number of households earning over $100,000 a year. That statistic alone should make you pause, because it tells you that the issue isn't just poverty anymore, it's the overall cost structure of modern life. Over the past 20 years, many of the biggest expenses people face have risen far faster than income growth. Healthcare costs have increased more than 250% since the early 2000s. college tuition has climbed over 170%, and housing, again one of the most critical expenses, has surged dramatically in nearly every major metropolitan area. Meanwhile, everyday necessities like groceries have experienced waves of price increases that quietly accumulate over time. Since 2021 alone, the average grocery bill in America has increased roughly 25%, and for certain staple foods, the increase has been even higher. Eggs, coffee, meat, and cooking oils have all experienced major price volatility due to supply chain disruptions and global commodity pressures. Now, here's the psychological effect of that constant pressure. When people feel like every aspect of daily life is becoming more expensive, they begin operating in survival mode rather than growth mode. Instead of planning vacations, investing, or pursuing hobbies, people focus almost entirely on managing expenses and avoiding financial emergencies. Surveys from financial institutions now show over 40% of Americans could not cover a $1,000 emergency expense without going into debt, which means a single unexpected bill, car repair, medical issue, appliance breakdown can immediately destabilize a household. And when a population lives under that kind of financial fragility for long enough, stress becomes a permanent background condition. It shows up in rising credit card balances, which recently surpassed $1 trillion in total outstanding debt, the highest ever recorded. It shows up in declining consumer confidence about the future. And it shows up in the growing sense that many people are simply exhausted from trying to keep up. Because the truth is, when life begins to feel like a never-ending financial balancing act with no clear path forward, it slowly erodes optimism across an entire society, and that erosion is exactly the kind of environment where people start to feel like they're approaching their breaking point. Americans are quietly drowning in debt, and it's reaching historic levels. What makes the situation even more unsettling is that beneath the surface of everyday life in America, an enormous debt bubble has been building, and most people don't fully realize just how large it has become. Right now, total U.S. household debt has surpassed $17.5 trillion, the highest level ever recorded in history. That includes mortgages, credit cards, auto loans, student loans, everything combined, and while debt itself isn't new, the speed at which it has grown over the last few years is what's truly alarming. Credit card balances alone recently crossed $1.13 trillion, which means Americans are increasingly relying on borrowed money just to maintain their standard of living. And here's where things start to get really concerning. Credit card interest rates are now averaging over 21%, the highest they've been since the Federal Reserve began tracking them decades ago. That means if someone carries a balance of just $5,000, they could end up paying thousands more in interest over time without even reducing the principal. But the problem doesn't stop there. Auto loans are also reaching unprecedented levels, with the average new car loan now exceeding $40,000 and nearly 1 in 5 car borrowers paying over $1,000 per month just to keep their vehicle. Think about how quickly that adds up when combined with rent, insurance, groceries, utilities, and childcare. For millions of households, the margin between stability and crisis has become razor thin. And economists are starting to notice another disturbing trend. Delinquencies are rising again, particularly among younger borrowers and lower-income households. In simple terms, more people are falling behind on their payments because the financial strain is becoming too heavy to manage. Historically, debt crises don't appear suddenly, they build slowly over years as people borrow more and more just to keep up with rising costs. And eventually, something breaks. That's why financial analysts are increasingly warning that the American consumer, the engine that drives roughly 70% of the U.S. economy, is becoming dangerously overstretched. Because when millions of people are simultaneously juggling credit cards, car payments, rent, student loans, and everyday living expenses, the system begins to rely on a fragile balancing act. Everything works as long as income keeps flowing and no unexpected shocks occur. But the moment that balance gets disrupted through layoffs, economic downturns, or rising interest rates, the pressure can cascade through the entire economy. And that's exactly why so many Americans feel like they're constantly walking a financial tightrope with no safety net beneath them. Trust in institutions has collapsed to levels not seen in generations. At the same time, all of this financial and social pressure has been building. Something equally significant has been happening on a cultural level. Americans are losing trust in nearly every major institution that once held society together. And the scale of this shift is honestly staggering when you look at the long-term data. According to Gallup polling that has tracked public trust for decades, confidence in institutions like government, media, banks, and large corporations has fallen to some of the lowest levels ever recorded. In the 1960s, for example, nearly 70% of Americans said they trusted the federal government to do the right thing most of the time. Today, that number is closer to 20% or even lower depending on the survey year. Trust in the media has collapsed even further, with only about 1 in 3 Americans saying they believe national news organizations report the facts accurately. And the same pattern is appearing in many other areas of society. Faith in Congress is near historic lows. Confidence in large corporations has declined. Even trust in institutions that once commanded widespread respect, like universities and the healthcare system, has become deeply polarized. What makes this especially important is that trust acts like the invisible glue that holds societies together. When people believe institutions are fair and functioning properly, they are far more willing to cooperate, follow rules, and work toward shared goals. But when trust breaks down, something very different begins to happen. People become suspicious. They question information, they assume hidden motives behind decisions, and eventually they start looking for alternative explanations, alternative communities, or entirely different systems. That shift is already visible across the country in ways that would have seemed unusual 20 or 30 years ago. People are abandoning traditional media sources in favor of independent creators. They're questioning long-standing narratives about economics, politics, and history. Some are even experimenting with entirely different ways of living, moving off-grid, relocating to smaller communities, or trying to escape the high-pressure environments of large cities altogether. Sociologists call this phenomenon institutional fragmentation, and historically it tends to appear during periods when societies feel like the old rules no longer apply. Once that process begins, it becomes very difficult to reverse because rebuilding trust takes far longer than losing it. And when a large portion of a population simultaneously stops believing the institutions guiding their lives, the entire social structure of a country begins to enter a period of profound transformation. Millions of Americans are quietly opting out of the system. Something even more dramatic has been unfolding over the last few years, and it's happening quietly enough that most headlines barely mention it. Yet the implications could reshape American society over the next decade. A growing number of Americans are no longer trying to fix the system, they're simply trying to leave it altogether. Now that might sound exaggerated at first, but the trends are very real when you look at the data. Since 2020, the United States has seen record levels of what economists call labor disengagement, meaning people are technically able to work but are choosing to step away from traditional employment structures. The most visible example was the Great Resignation, when over 47 million Americans voluntarily quit their jobs in 2021 alone, the highest number ever recorded. But what's fascinating is that the trend didn't fully reverse afterward. Millions of people never returned to the exact same kind of work they left. Some shifted to remote jobs, others became freelancers, and a surprising number began experimenting with alternative lifestyles that reject the traditional career ladder entirely. Searches for things like off-grid living, tiny homes, homesteading, and digital nomad visas have exploded on Google over the last few years, reflecting a quiet cultural shift that many economists didn't predict. Meanwhile, the number of Americans working multiple income streams, side hustles, gig work, online businesses has grown dramatically as people try to escape reliance on a single employer. But perhaps the most shocking indicator of this shift is migration patterns inside the country itself. Large metropolitan areas like New York, Los Angeles, and San Francisco have experienced significant population declines as people relocate to smaller cities or rural areas where the cost of living is lower and life feels more manageable. According to U.S. Census data, millions of Americans have moved across state lines since 2020, the largest domestic migration shift in decades, and the reason many people give is strikingly similar. They're searching for a lifestyle that feels more stable, more affordable, and less exhausting than the one they left behind. Sociologists say this phenomenon is a form of quiet withdrawal, where individuals stop investing emotionally or financially in institutions they believe no longer serve them. They're not protesting loudly, they're not necessarily rebelling in obvious ways. Instead, they're slowly changing how they live, working differently, spending differently, and redefining what success actually means. And when enough people start quietly stepping away from the expectations that once defined a society, it signals something profound, a growing realization that the system people were taught to trust may no longer be capable of delivering the life they were promised. America is approaching a collective breaking point. At the end of the day, when you step back and connect all these pieces together, the financial pressure, the rising debt, the mental exhaustion, the collapse of trust, the generational disillusionment, you start to see why so many people across the country feel like something fundamental is shifting beneath their feet. What's happening in America right now isn't just a single crisis. It's the convergence of multiple pressures hitting society at the exact same time. Historically, societies can handle one major disruption at a time: an economic recession, a political conflict, or a cultural shift. But when several of those forces collide simultaneously, the strain on everyday life becomes enormous. And that's exactly what we're seeing now. Inflation has eroded purchasing power. Housing has become less accessible than it has been in decades. Debt levels are reaching historic highs. Mental health struggles are rising across every age group. At the same time, the digital world has fundamentally changed how people interact, how they receive information, and how they interpret reality itself. All of this creates what sociologists describe as systemic fatigue, a condition where large populations begin to feel emotionally and psychologically drained by the structure of the society around them. And the signs of that fatigue are everywhere. People say they feel numb, they feel disconnected, they feel like the future is harder to imagine than it used to be. But here's the thing that makes this moment so significant. Historically, periods like this often become turning points. When a population collectively realizes that the old rules no longer produce the outcomes they expected, change eventually follows, sometimes gradually, sometimes suddenly. Economists, historians, and sociologists all recognize this pattern across different eras and different civilizations. A system runs smoothly for decades, then pressures build beneath the surface until enough people begin questioning whether the system still works the way it was supposed to. And that's the moment where societies either adapt, reform, or transform entirely. Right now, millions of Americans are feeling that exact tension. Not necessarily anger, not necessarily rebellion, but a deep, growing awareness that the way things are structured may not be sustainable forever. Whether that awareness leads to meaningful change or simply a long period of adjustment is something no one can predict yet. But one thing is becoming increasingly clear. Something is happening in America right now, and the feeling that people are reaching their breaking point is no longer just an opinion, it's a reality that more and more individuals are beginning to recognize every single day. So when people say something feels different in America right now, they're not imagining it. The pressure has been building for years: rising costs, rising debt, declining trust, and a growing feeling that the system people were told would reward hard work just isn't working the way it used to. And when millions of people start feeling that pressure at the same time, history shows that societies eventually reach a turning point. Sometimes that leads to reform, sometimes it leads to major change. But one thing is certain, the tension doesn't stay hidden forever. Now I want to hear from you. Are you feeling this shift too? Or do you think people are exaggerating what's happening right now? Let me know down in the comments because I read as many of them as I can. And if you found this video interesting or informative, make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next one. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.